Hi there, everybody. So today we're going to talk about asking questions as a way to boost what we called ratio in the last video. That is the proportion of cognitive work that is performed by students during a lesson. And then we're going to take a look at a specific questioning technique that we're all very, very familiar with, cold calling, and show how it can be modified to make it particularly effective at boosting both the participation ratio and the thinking ratio in ways that are going to make the classroom much more dynamic and exciting and interesting for students. So we know that asking questions well can make the classroom much more engaging and interesting for students, but it's important to recognize that that's not the actual purpose of asking questions, right? The purpose of asking questions well in the classroom is to boost the quality of thinking that happens in the classroom, ideally among most, if not all, of the students that are present. And so what we need to do is we need to have some techniques to ensure that our questioning is able to accomplish that. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of teachers, most of us have the habit, it's very easy to fall in the habit of asking the same type of question over and over again. It kind of becomes like our default mode. But we want to think about asking questions as a way of evoking a variety of types of thinking among the students, right? We need to be conscious that we want our students to do a variety of different types of thinking. And so we need to have questions that are able to provoke the type of thinking that we are desiring to evoke in the students. So when I say that, what exactly do I mean by that? So for example, one type of question is the question that's purely involved in is memory retrieval, right? So if you think about what I talked about in the prior lesson, where we talk about how critical thinking really relies on a good factual basis stored in long-term memory, one of the things that we can do in asking questions is to help them retrieve stuff from memory in order to help encode the information more deeply in memory, right? As you recall, working memory is very small, it's very limited, and so unless the students have lots of information stored in long-term memory, their ability to think critically is kind of weakened by having to juggle bits of information in working memory while they're trying to do the thinking. So we want to encode stuff in long-term memory. The other thing that's important to think about is this idea of the forgetting curve. So we know from cognitive science that what happens is, students will learn something and they'll have that knowledge in their head, but over time it's going to fade. As soon as they leave the classroom, it starts fading. An hour later, it's less and less and less, and by the end of the day, it's very, very low. They're remembering a very small proportion of what they've learned. So one way that we could sort of interrupt this forgetting curve is by forcing students to come into contact with that information again, to be asked to remember that piece of information again. And so here we have, for example, the first repetition of it. Suddenly they remember it again, it's here, and then again over time, that memory is going to degrade over time. But you'll notice that over time, this curve becomes less steep. And then if we reintroduce the idea again to the student, force them to recall it again, it increases the memory, and as it fades even, it degrades even more slowly and less. And so eventually, as we have them exposed to that piece of information over time, they actually have, of course, there's going to be some degradation in their memory, and they're not going to remember everything. But it is a much higher level than what it was if they had just been exposed at once and let it degrade over time. So this is the idea behind asking memory retrieval questions. One of the nice things about memory retrieval questions is students actually like these kinds of questions because they are very straightforward. They're easy for them to answer, assuming that they've spent the time mastering it. And that opportunity to get that answer correct is something that students find quite gratifying. And so these types of questions are really, really helpful to ask. And they're very simple. They don't take a lot of time because recall is often very quick. And you could pepper through a bunch of them really quickly and get a lot of that information out. So what do I mean when I talk about a memory retrieval question? So these are fairly straightforward questions. For example, if you're teaching a strategy class, you might ask the students, say, name the pestle forces that impact the environment that firms function in. And, students will have to spend a little bit of time thinking of it, and then eventually, they'll come up with things like political, economic, technological, socio-cultural, et cetera, right? And so that type of recall is useful for encoding stuff in long-term memory. Another type of thinking that we want to do, and another type of question we want to ask, are questions that check for understanding, right? So there are a way of ensuring that the students actually have some understanding of the material and not just have it by rote memorization. So for example, you could ask a question like, let's say the Bank of Japan has raised interest rates. What force is that? And why, right? So here, you're checking their understanding of some of the terms in the PESTLE framework and asking them to identify, which one interest rates falls under. All right, and so that is a different type of thinking because you're testing their understanding and knowing whether they actually get the concept as opposed to just have it memorized. A third type of question is an application question, right? So, you've taught them something and you want to test whether or not they can apply the concept in some type of a situation or a circumstance. An example of that kind of question might be something like, again, in strategy, it's like, let's say your company buys parts from the widget industry. That industry is going through a wave of mergers and acquisitions. How is that going to affect your industry's profitability? Right, and explain that process to me. So here, the students are taking Porter's 5 Forces framework and having to apply it by identifying the way that consolidation is going to affect, in this particular case, supplier power. Right, and so that's an application type question. So you're getting them to think about this material in a different way, where they're actually applying it, using it, manipulating concepts. Another type of question that you might want to ask are perception questions. And these questions are actually can be really useful as a sort of a groundwork for a deeper type of thinking. So what do I mean by that? So let's say, for example, that you've just assigned students 2 articles, and one of those articles was about Apple's rollout of the Apple Watch, and another was about Sony's rollout of its smartwatch a couple of years earlier, right? So in that case, you might ask a question like, what do you notice about how Apple managed the rollout of the Apple Watch, say, compared to Sony's rollout of its smartwatch 2 years earlier, right? And then, as the students, in that particular case, the students are kind of looking at these two situations and thinking about differences and noticing things that they might not have noticed just in the act of reading the articles themselves. Right. So again, you're getting them. This is a type of thinking where they're making them aware of things and training their awareness and their ability to sort of recognize stuff that's going on. And then a final type of question that we might want to ask are discovery questions. And these often dovetail really quite nicely with perception questions. For example, in this particular case, you might ask a follow-up question, how might the differences in the ways that the two companies handled the rollouts of their watches explain the vastly different outcomes? Right. And so in that particular situation, then the students are going to be thinking through some of the stuff that they've noticed and trying to discover some more general principles on the basis of some of the things that they're noticed. So again, it's a higher level of thinking, and it's a little bit brings in more critical thinking and analysis. So you want to have like a toolkit of types of questions that you could ask the students in order to ensure that a wide variety of thinking is happening in the classroom, and also to keep that classroom more interesting and engaged. One of the key things, though, about ensuring that the questioning is effective in the classroom and that it keeps it engaged is you want to make sure that the way that you're implementing questioning boosts what we referred to as ratio in the last lecture. That is, you want to ensure that you have the broad level of participation among students and not just like a couple of students who are answering everything. And you want to increase the quality of the thinking that happens in the classroom in response to those questions. And so one way of doing this is by using what Limov refers to as wait time, right? That is, you want to give students some time to think about a question and use some subtle encouragement to get more students to volunteer to answer that question. So, what is wait time? So wait time involves waiting anywhere from 5 to 10 seconds after asking a question before taking answers. And a couple of the things that this can do in the classroom are the following, right? So first, it allows for more hands to go up. A lot of times what will happen in the classroom is you'll ask a question and boom, you've got one or two students, they throw the same two or three students, right, will throw their hands up and they'll have an answer. And typically what that will do is other students who are maybe they're thinking about the question, maybe they have an idea in their head, but if they see the other hands go up, they're not going to raise their hands. If you call on them immediately, those students don't even have a chance to raise their hands. If you wait for 5 seconds, it allows those students who actually might have something to say but are just not those highly verbal students to sort of think about what they want to do and then raise their hand. So you can get more participation that way. Second thing is, because it does that, it enables a wider range of students to contribute. You're not just relying on your 2 or 3 go-tos. You're not just relying on the types of ideas that those 2 or 3 students have, but instead you get a wider range of students, and different types of students are able to contribute to the discussion because you've waited for enough time for some students who maybe are just not quite as quick or eager or aggressive to actually participate. The other thing that wait time does is it encourages answers that are more thoughtful, because if a student, boom, 1 second, question is done, they raise their hand, and you call on them, they haven't really had time to think through what it is that you've asked them. They may just have an inkling of an idea, and they throw their hands up, and then they're going to kind of think through it while they're answering the question, and those answers can be, sometimes be poorly thought out or not particularly germane or not particularly interesting. So by giving the students time to think before you actually call on somebody, you give them an opportunity to come up with more thorough, thoughtful answers, sometimes giving them an opportunity to think about the evidence and bring that into their answer as well. And that's particularly useful because we don't just want to encourage students to participate, we want to encourage them to think, and we don't just want them to do gut reaction thinking, we want them to do actually cognitively rich thinking. So giving them time allows that. So in order to make this work, though, you need to provide some guidance for students for what to do during wait time. If you don't do that, what may happen, and what will often happen is you'll have that time where you're waiting for 5 to 10 seconds, and students are just kind of waiting around for something to happen. So if you don't want that to happen, it's really useful to give them some guidance on what to do during wait time by making some comments. So for example, they're very simple. They can be really straightforward. You ask a question and you say something like, hey, take a few seconds to think this through. So you've directed students to actually do some thinking, and you're watching them do it, and you can kind of encourage them to do the thinking by just directing them to do it instead of just having them waiting around. Another comment you might make is something like, hey, jot down your ideas on this. So that way they're doing some writing. It's very low threat activity because the ideas, they're jotting them down. That way if you call on them or they'll see that they have something written down, they're more likely to raise their hand because now they don't have to worry about, am I going to forget what I'm going to say, because they've actually jotted it down. And the act of jotting it down is a type of thinking. So that's boosting that participation ratio, because the more students who are jotting, the more students who are thinking, the more students who are involved. You might also say something like, check your notes to see if you can find it. So if it's more of a recall question, if it's more of a memory question, less of a thinking question, you give the chance the students some encouragement to actually look through their notes to try to find what it is that you're asking about. And that's going to help them, again, with participation, help them with understanding. Or you might ask something like, say you've asked a question, you see a couple hands up, your mainstays. You can say, okay, I see 3 hands, 4, great. Give me some more. I'd like to see some more. I want to see everybody thinking about this. So again, you're encouraging the students to start participating. And as hands get raised up, you can kind of count, okay, that's 5, 8, nice, 10, okay, we're getting there, let me see some more. Just that kind of subtle, simple encouragement can really make students who are kind of on the fence about whether or not they want to participate decide to jump right in. So these are the kinds of things that you can do to make that 5 to 10 seconds more useful. And then the final thing that I want to say about this is don't spend all of that 5 to 10 seconds talking and saying these things. You want to make these encouraging remarks in order to get the ball rolling. But after that, step back, give them some silence so that they actually can do the thinking that you want them to do. Okay, now I want to talk about cold calling. So what is cold calling? Right? Cold calling is a technique that involves calling on a student to answer a question regardless of whether they've raised their hand to answer. The basic technique here has as its goal to get to this ideal ratio where we've got maximum participation and maximum thinking. So how exactly are we going to do that? Well, we have to manage who answers when and how they're answering. So it's not enough to just get an answer. By the way, I should have mentioned this earlier. One of the things that you really want to be careful about when you are using questions in the classroom is not letting students just blurt out answers. What's typically going to happen is those highly motivated, highly verbal students are going to raise their hand, and if you don't call on them right away, they're going to blurt out their answers. Or they're not even going to raise their hand, they're going to blurt out their answers. And if they blurt out an answer, you've basically short-circuited the thinking for everybody who hasn't had time to think through the question. So you do need to create a norm in the classroom that students are not just going to blurt out answers, but they are going to wait. And also, when you force them to wait until you decide who's going to talk, either take the hand that you want, if the hands are raised, pick the person that you are going to have answer, or do the cold call, name someone whether their hand is raised or not. That makes it so that you have control over who's answering. It prevents people from blurting stuff out, and it gives everybody a chance to do some thinking. So this is a really, really important thing to keep in mind if you're using questioning in the classroom. The other thing to think about is again, picking people for a particular reason. I think I'll go into that just a little bit later. Let me just talk a little bit about what exactly is the cold calling technique. So, the first thing is cold calling is, a technique that starts with asking a question, right? Very, very simple. We're going to ask a question, and the next thing we're going to do is, as I talked about before, is provide wait time. All right, so you ask a question, you pause, you give a little bit of time, and then you're going to call on the student. And the reason we do it this way are several, and they're related to what I talked about before. We postpone naming the student because you want to make sure that every student is answering their question in their head as you ask it, right? If you say a student's name first, and then you ask the question, the minute you say that student name, most of the other students in the class are going to tune out because they know they're not going to be called on. And so they're just going to be like, oh, that question's for them. It's not relevant to me. Boom, tune out. So you want to make sure that you wait to ask the student question. And we pause, of course, for the same reason we paused when we talked about wait time, is you're trying to give the students time to think. All right. So that's the essence of the cold calling strategy. Now, a couple things about using cold calling, because it is a little bit more of a high-risk strategy than the earlier one where it's like you're doing wait time and you're encouraging students to raise their hand. So in that situation, it's less of a high-risk strategy because you're going to call on someone who's raised their hand already, and they're expecting to be called on because that's why they've raised their hand. With cold calling, you're calling on students regardless of whether they've raised their hand. Now, you may call on a student who's raised his or her hand, or you may call on a student who hasn't raised his or her hand. There's a little bit more risk in that, and so in order to make that work, you need to keep a couple of things in mind. All right. The first one, you want to keep the entire cold calling experience positive, right? It's not a punishment for not having prepared or for not paying attention. So this is not a situation where, you've asked a question, a bunch of students have raised their hand, and there's a couple students who are not paying attention. This is not a situation where you're going to call on the students who aren't paying attention as kind of a gotcha, or to show, hey, I've noticed you're not paying attention, or to embarrass them for because they're not going to be prepared. You don't want to do that because you don't want to taint the cold calling experience by making it something that is negative or something that's seen as a punishment, right? This method is meant to be, and the experience of being cold called is meant to be something that's positive. You want the students to feel that this is an opportunity for them to share their ideas, to express themselves, to stretch themselves, to feel like their ideas matter, even if they're not the type of student who regularly raises his or her hand, or even if they're the type of student that maybe lacks some self-confidence. So you want this experience to be positive. So the minute you start using it as a punishment or as a got you, you really ruin the experience. So really resist that temptation. All right. Because it's meant to be positive, then, you also want to ensure that when you're calling on students, you need to put in some effort into making sure that you're projecting some warmth and you're projecting encouragement. This is particularly true when you're calling on the shyer students or the students that are more hesitant, but it really should be a general rule. Now, if you've got students who are tuning out, not paying attention, or goofing off, you need to have a different technique to handle that, not one that will taint cold calling. The next thing about making cold calling effective is you want to make sure that it is predictable and that it is happening frequently in the classroom, right? It needs to be frequent enough that it's normalized and it's regular and students are expecting it at any moment in time. Doing this will ensure that students will spend a larger proportion of your class engaged, listening, and focused and ready to answer. Because if they know that cold calls happen all the time, they recognize that they need to be paying attention so that if they're called on, they actually are able to contribute something. You can also let them know it's coming. Like if you're going to go into a whole bunch of cold calling, it pays, it might pay to just make everybody aware. It's like, hey, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions so everybody be ready, just to call their attention so that people aren't taken by surprise. The next thing is you want to make sure that your questions are clear. I'm sure we've all had this experience, at least I know I've had it many, many times. In the classroom, I'll be talking about something and then kind of off the cuff, I'll formulate a question and I'll throw it out there. And then the students will kind of struggle with it, or I'll get an answer that wasn't really addressing the question, or it might take us off on a tangent. A lot of times I look back at that question, I'm like, I realized that I didn't ask a question that was very clear, or the question I had was hard to parse, or it was really kind of obscure, or the students, it's not surprising that students struggle with it because the question lacked clarity. So you want to be sure to the best that you can that you're asking questions that are quite clear, that the students know what they're being asked, and questions where you have a good idea about what a likely or correct or reasonable answer would be. All right. Those types of questions make it much more easy for students to participate in cold calling, makes them more comfortable, and they don't feel like if you ask them a question that's really hard for them to parse and make sense of, and then you call on somebody who didn't raise their hand, that can be a really negative experience. So please be sure that you're using clear questions. The next thing is you do need to make sure that your cold calling involves everybody, right? You want to have everybody called on a regular enough basis that the students recognize that being called on is something that has a reasonable probability of happening at any given moment in time in the classroom, because that and the frequency and predictability are part of what makes it so that students are staying tuned in during the classroom, right? It makes them answer the questions in their head when you ask them because they recognize that they could be actually called on to provide their thoughts on that issue. Okay? The other thing is, if you ask a question that has some depth to the answer, that might require a number of steps or a good deal of thinking in order to answer fully, it's often useful to break that question up into smaller bits and then connect them through a sequence of questions that you parse out to different students. And the reason for that is if you ask a question that is, richer and more complicated, and you call on a student who has has to work through all of that stuff, or even one who has the capacity to work through all of that stuff, their answer is going to be quite a long, involved answer. And so when they're giving a long and involved answer, it's very easy for the other students to tune out because they realize that this answer is going to take such a long time. I don't really need to pay attention because I'm not going to get called on. So it's much better to let a student give part of an answer and then call on someone else to continue the idea, or to break the question up into manageable chunks so that you could shoot different questions to different people as kind of a sequence. Another advantage of doing it that way is for the students that aren't as quick, that aren't as able to give the sort of in-depth analysis over time. What you do by breaking it up and having students answer a part of the question along is you kind of create steps for those students to sort of gradually understand the concept so they get the entire concept because they see it unfold more slowly over time. Okay? And then the final thing is, which is related to making sure everyone gets called, but that's being intentional about who you call on and why. You want to try to match the difficulty of the question to the capacity of the students, which does require you to have some understanding of your students' level of understanding. So this is one of the advantages that those earlier types of questions like check for understanding and memory retrieval are helpful for, because by asking those types of questions, you'll get a sense for where the students are at and what their knowledge level is, and a better sense for a student's capacity to answer more complicated questions. So be intentional about who you call on, why you're calling on those students, and match it to their capacity. The other thing is you may need to, when you have students that are particularly anxious, or students who are shy, or students who have language issues, you may need to, and it's perfectly reasonable to, what Limov calls pre-call. That is, talk to them in advance, let them know that you're going to call on them, maybe give them a sense for what you're going to ask about. You might, inform them before class just so that they're prepared. Do what it takes so that those students aren't traumatized by the act of cold calling, but are actually able to appreciate the cold call experience. All right, and then a final thing to note about cold calling is, this strategy can be really effective by itself, but one of the nice things about it is that it works in synergy with a lot of the other techniques in Teach Like a Champion that we're going to get into in later sessions. And when worked in combination with these things, it is can be really, really useful, and we'll get into that later. So what are some of the benefits of cold calling? First, it can create a culture of engaged attention in the classroom, right? The students are expecting to be called on, they're paying attention, and then there's a lot of back and forth between you and the student. So it's not just you talking, and this is really more interesting for students. It helps with the pacing of the class, right? Pacing is the sense that things are moving quickly in the class, and the sense that time is moving quickly. This is really beneficial for students because they want to feel that the class is interesting, and so a quick passage of time, the sense of a quick passage of time, is something that helps them make it feel interesting. It breaks up the class, and it gives students a sense of time going quickly and being more enjoyable. So when you ask those questions and you get the response, and you've got a lot of different students involved, it really boosts both the energy level and the sense that class is engaging, interesting, and moving quickly. It also allows you to check for understanding, right? Because, again, if you're just lecturing and talking, you don't know until you give an assessment or a test or an assignment how much the students are getting it. But by calling on students, and by calling on all the students with cold calling, you really start to get a much more fine-grained and immediate sense for how well the students are understanding the material that you're trying to teach them, and that's really, really useful for instruction. And then finally, it gives students voice. What's really interesting about cold calling is when I initially started using it, I was really worried, that students are going to hate this because the students aren't volunteering and I'm forcing them to do something that they don't want to do by calling on students who haven't raised their hand. And one of the things I was really surprised and gratified to find out was that actually a lot of students appreciated being called on once they got used to it. Of course, you will always have the students who just they really don't want to do this and it's really unpleasant for them. But, my sense is that the majority of the students actually enjoy sharing their ideas, but they're just not the kind of student that volunteers all the time or raises their hand. Maybe they don't want to be seen as being too eager. Maybe they're worried that if they raise their hand and say something, people are going to think that they're trying to show off, or whatever those sort of social pressures exist. They're there in the classroom. And so when you call on a student who hasn't raised their hand, you're actually giving them license to share their ideas in a way that's much less threatening. Because instead of the sense that, oh, I'm thinking my idea is so good, I got to share it, you're the one who's asking for their ideas. So it's kind of their responsibility to do it. And so it allows them to feel good about sharing the ideas without feeling like they're going out on a limb. And I find that actually a large percentage of my students really enjoy being asked to participate in that way, right? It gives the sense that everybody's take on something has some meaning, it matters, their learning matters, and they get to participate without having to act like they're some type of smarty pants. And this is something that a lot of students really appreciate. So that's basically all I have to share today. I hope that was helpful, and thank you very much.